Listen. With the night falling, we are saying thank you. We are stopping on the bridges to bow from the railings. We are running out of the glass rooms with our mouths full of food to look at the sky and say thank you. We are standing by the water, thanking it, standing by the windows, looking out in our directions. Back from a series of hospitals, back from a mugging, after funerals, we are saying thank you. After the news of the dead, whether or not we knew them, we are saying thank you. Over telephones, we are saying thank you. In doorways, into the backs of cars and in elevators, remembering wars and the police at the door and the beatings on stairs, we are saying thank you. In the banks, we are saying thank you. In the faces of the officials and the rich and of all who will never change, we go on saying thank you, thank you. With the animals dying around us, taking our feelings, we are saying thank you. With the forests falling faster than the minutes of our lives, we are saying thank you. With the words going out like cells of a brain, with the cities growing over us, we are saying thank you faster and faster. With nobody listening, we are saying thank you, we are saying, and waving, dark though it is. What I would like to do this evening is to read, going back some distance to the 60s, and read a few poems from back then and come forward in a sort of roughly chronological order. But the first poem that I want to read is a story poem. One of the things that's happened in the last 25 years or so is that narrative has moved into, taken different forms in the poetry of the last few decades, and reasserted itself, and sometimes in very exciting ways, I think. I wasn't thinking of literary history, of course, when I wrote this poem. Someone had asked me to tell a story, and I told this story, and I thought, this story is a very unpleasant story, but it's a poem. It's a myth. It's unlike most myths, which there are many myths of origin. There are very seldom myths about the other end of things, and this is one of them. It's called The Last One. Well, they'd made up their minds to be everywhere, because why not? Everywhere was theirs because they thought so. They with two leaves, they whom the birds despise. In the middle of stones, they made up their minds. They started to cut. Well, they cut everything because why not? Everything was theirs because they thought so. It fell into its shadows and they took both away, some to have, some for burning. Well, cutting everything, they came to the water. They came to the end of the day. There was one left standing. They would cut it tomorrow. They went away. The night gathered in the last branches. The shadow of the night gathered in the shadow on the water. The night and the shadow put on the same head, and it said, now. Well, in the morning they cut the last one. Like the others, the last one fell into its shadow. It fell into its shadow on the water. They took it away, its shadow stayed on the water. Well, they shrugged. They started trying to get the shadow away. They cut right to the ground. The shadow stayed whole. They laid boards on it. The shadow came out on top. They shone lights on it. The shadow got blacker and clearer. They exploded the water. The shadow rocked. They built a huge fire on the roots. They sent up black smoke between the shadow and the sun. The new shadow flowed without changing the old one. They shrugged. They went away to get stones. They came back. The shadow was growing. They started setting up stones. It was growing. They looked the other way. It went on growing. They decided they would make a stone out of it. They took stones to the water. They poured them into the shadow. They poured them in. They poured them in. The stones vanished. The shadow was not filled. It went on growing. That was one day. The next day was just the same. It went on growing. They did all the same things. It was just the same. They decided to take its water from under it. They took away water. They took it away. The water went down. The shadow stayed where it was before. It went on growing. It grew onto the land. They started to scrape the shadow with machines. When it touched the machines, it stayed on them. They started to beat the shadow with sticks. Where it touched the sticks, it stayed on them. They started to beat the shadow with hands. Where it touched the hands, it stayed on them. That was another day. Well, the next day started about the same. It went on growing. They pushed lights into the shadow. Where the shadow got onto them, they went out. They began to stomp on the edge. It got their feet. And when it got their feet, they fell down. It got into eyes. The eyes went blind. The ones that fell down, it grew over and they vanished. The ones that went blind and walked into it vanished. The ones that could see and stood still, it swallowed their shadows. Then it swallowed them too, and they vanished. Well, the others ran. The ones that were left went away to live if it would let them. They went as far as they could, the lucky ones with their shadows. There's a related poem. I want to deliberately read these two together at the beginning because they mark sort of current that seems to be a part of the way I have looked at the world for a very long time. It's not a particularly cozy current, but and the reason I'm reading this one is because I first wrote it in as I said, in the 60s, the same period as the other one, more or less. And I'd learned that there was a project to build a bridge across the bottom of the Sea of Cortez from Baja California to Mexico for salt trucks to take salt across to make it go faster and more profitably. And this, of course, would effectively cut off the Sea of Cortez to whales. And it's the main calving ground for the gray whale, and one of the only two calving grounds, and would probably render that great species extinct in a very few years. That project, fortunately, did not come to what was planned for it, but there are new plans, as you know, now in the Sea of Cortez for things which would be very much like that and would have some of the same effects. So I'd hope that this would be an incomprehensible poem eventually, but it's still the same story. And of course, the gray whale is not the only whale that has been threatened. What species has not been threatened, in fact? But the gray whale, in the intervening years, the declining population of the gray whale actually rose, and the whale was having a kind of comeback, and now it's threatened again. For a coming extinction. Gray whale, now that we are sending you to the end, that great God, tell him that we who follow you invented forgiveness and forgive nothing. I write as though you could understand and I could say it. One must always pretend something among the dying. When you have left the seas nodding on their stalks, empty of you, tell him that we were made on another day. The bewilderment will diminish like an echo winding along your inner mountains, unheard by us, and find its way out, leaving behind it the future, dead and ours. When you will not see again the whale calves crying the light, consider what you will find in the black garden and its court. The sea cows, the great auks, the gorillas, the irreplaceable hosts ranged countless and foreordaining as stars, our sacrifices. Join your word to theirs. Tell him that it is we who are important. There's a series of poems in the 10 years that followed that in a book, one of the books that came afterwards. There's a series of poems all with the same title. They're all called A Door. When I was growing up, when I was a child and then an adolescent, I wanted to be a painter. I thought that would be a wonderful thing to do. And I made some terrible paintings, and there was nobody around to teach me painting. And I was not Grandma Moses. So I felt kind of finally the way Dr. Johnson did about the violin. You know, Dr. Johnson played the violin when he was young, and somebody said to him later, "Sir, I hear that at one time you were a fiddler." And he said, "Yes." He said, "Well, why have you not gone on with your violin?" He said, "Sir, I thought that if I were to be a fiddler, I would want to be a very fine fiddler, and I had other things to do," he said. So he gave it up. But I stopped trying to be a painter. And this series of doors was something that I had in my mind in the early 70s. And I had an idea about how I wanted to paint them. And when I tried, I was very discontented with the result. But in the meantime, I was writing poems about doors. And there were these 4 that survived, and this is one of them. A door. You walk on, carrying on your shoulders a glass door to some house that's not been found. There's no handle. You can't insure it, can't put it down. And you pray, "Please let me not fall, please, please let me not drop it," because you drown like water in the pieces. So you walk on with your hands frozen to your glass wings in the wind, while down the door in time with your feet, skies are marching like water down the inside of a bell. Those skies are looking for you. They've left everything. They want you to remember them. They want to write some last phrase on you. But they keep washing off. They need your ears. You can't hear them. They need your eyes, but you can't look up now. They need your feet. Oh, they need your feet to go on. They send out their dark birds for you, each one the last, like shadows of doors, calling, calling, sailing the other way. So it sounds like goodbye. I want to read a very different kind of poem before I leave that period altogether. I'll read 2 more from that time. One is a poem. I noticed that a lot of them are in the second person in one way or another, and the most recent ones that I've been working on are all in the second person. So I don't know what that tells me, but it wasn't planned that way. When you're asked questions, the assumption always seems to be that you had it all worked out in advance, and I certainly never did that, but not very well anyway. I was very lucky in my late teens to know John Barrowman and go and take him poems regularly, which he systematically destroyed, and I learned a certain amount that way. There's never been anybody like him. He was, I think, a fantastic poet, incredible literary intelligence, tormented and very difficult man, and very valued. I mean, I learned things from him that I learned from nobody else. So the poem is simply called Merwin. I will tell you what he told me in the years just after the war, as we then called the Second World War. Don't lose your arrogance yet, he said. You can do that when you're older. Lose it too soon and you may merely replace it with vanity. Just one time he suggested changing the usual order of the same words in a line of verse. Why point out a thing twice? He suggested I pray to the muse, get down on my knees and pray right there in the corner, and he said he meant it literally. It was in the days before the beard and the drink, but he was deep in tides of his own, through which he sailed, chin sideways and head tilted like a tacking sloop. He was far older than the dates allowed for, much older than I was. He was in his 30s. He snapped down his nose with an accent I think he had affected in England. As for publishing, he advised me to paper my wall with rejection slips. His lips and the bones of his long fingers trembled with the vehemence of his views about poetry. He said the great presence that permitted everything and transmuted it in poetry was passion. Passion was genius, and he praised movement and invention. I had hardly begun to read. I asked, how can you ever be sure that what you write is really any good at all? And he said, you can't. You can't. You can never be sure. You die without knowing whether anything you wrote was any good. If you have to be sure, don't write. And another totally different kind of poem from that time, which was the 70s and early 80s. This one's called The Black Jewel. There are a lot of insect poems running through the poems, and I don't know what that means. In the dark, there is only the sound of the cricket. South wind in the leaves is the cricket. So is the surf on the shore and the barking across the valley. The cricket never sleeps. The whole cricket is the pupil of one eye. It can run, it can leap, it can fly. In its back the moon crosses the night. There is only one cricket when I listen. The cricket lives in the unlit ground, in the roots, out of the wind. It has only the one sound. Before I could talk, I heard the cricket under the house. Then I remembered summer. Mice, too, and the blind lightning are born hearing the cricket. Dying, they hear it. Bodies of light turn listening to the cricket. The cricket is neither alive nor dead. The death of the cricket is still the cricket. In the bare room, the luck of the cricket echoes. I want to jump to a book called The Rain in the Trees and read a few poems from that. And first, a poem called Late Spring. It's the first poem in the book. Coming into the high room again after years, after oceans and shadows of hills and the sounds of lies, after losses and feet on stairs, after looking and mistakes and forgetting, turning there thinking to find no one except those I knew. Finally I saw you sitting in white, already waiting. You of whom I had heard with my own ears since the beginning, for whom more than once I had opened the door, believing you were not far. number of poems from this book that I want to read. The next one is called Sight. In a way, about the evolution of sight, but sight literally and metaphorically. Once a single cell found that it was full of light, and for the first time there was seeing. When I was a bird, I could see where the stars had turned, and I set out on my journey. High in the head of a mountain goat, I could see across a valley under the shining trees something moving. Deep in the green sea, I saw two sides of the water and swam between them. I look at you in the first light of the morning for as long as I can. There's a poem I'm looking for in this book, and I know it's here. There it is. It's a poem that's been used in different ways on a number of occasions, and I've been told about it afterwards. So I have to think, now why did they use that poem, and what were they thinking of, and what did it mean on the occasion? And I'm sort of pondering that one afterwards. One more thing that I don't know. But I'll read it and you can guess for yourselves. It's called Thanks. Listen, with the night falling, we are saying thank you. We are stopping on the bridges to bow from the railings. We are running out of the glass rooms with our mouths full of food to look at the sky and say thank you. We are standing by the water, thanking it, standing by the windows, looking out in our directions. Back from a series of hospitals, back from a mugging, after funerals, we are saying thank you. After the news of the dead, whether or not we knew them, we are saying thank you. Over telephones, we are saying thank you. In doorways, into the backs of cars and in elevators, remembering wars and the police at the door and the beatings on stairs, we are saying thank you. In the banks, we are saying thank you. In the faces of the officials and the rich and of all who will never change, we go on saying thank you, thank you. With the animals dying around us, taking our feelings, we are saying thank you. With the forests falling faster than the minutes of our lives, we are saying thank you. With the words going out like cells of a brain, with the cities growing over us, we are saying thank you faster and faster. With nobody listening, we are saying thank you, we are saying, and waving, dark though it is. The poem that Naomi referred to, I want to read as one kind of allusion to Hawaii and to its wonderful, painful, unfinished and terrible, but beautiful history. One of the most beautiful places on the planet, and of course one of the most exploited and abused. It's also a poem about history. It's a poem about the way things that seem to happen in isolation are happening at the same time, and that there is always a connection that we don't understand. Chord. While Keats wrote, they were cutting down the sandalwood forests. While he listened to the nightingale, they heard their own axes echoing through the forests. While he sat in the walled garden on the hill outside the city, they thought of their gardens dying far away on the mountain. While the sound of the words clawed at him, they thought of their wives. While the tip of his pen traveled, the iron they had coveted was hateful to them. While he thought of the Grecian woods, they bled under red flowers. While he dreamed of wine, the trees were falling from the trees. While he felt his heart, they were hungry and their faith was sick. While the song broke over him, they were in a secret place and they were cutting it forever. While he coughed, they carried the trunks to the hole in the forest the size of a foreign ship. While he groaned on the voyage to Italy, they fell on the trails and were broken. When he lay with the odes behind him, the wood was sold for cannons. When he lay watching the window, they came home and lay down. And an age arrived when everything was explained in another language. The most recent published book was The River Sound. And I began with a story, the last one. And I want to read another story poem written several decades after that one. This one, the germ of it came from a Guarani legend that was recorded by somebody named Ernesto Morales, about whom I've never been able to find out anything else. There's this one little tiny book that I bought in South America years ago, and I've never been able to find out anything about it. It seems to have disappeared from libraries, from everywhere else. But anyway, he did some recording of just sort of notations of Guarani legends, and this one really stuck. I was amazed by it. And I thought it must have been a poem. It couldn't have been these notations. Nobody would have remembered those. The Guarani Indians would not have carried this, and brought out a sort of footnote to tell each other. It had to be something else. The Stranger. One day in the forest, there was somebody who had never been there before. It was somebody like the monkeys, but taller and without a tail and without so much hair, standing up and walking on only 2 feet. And as he went, he heard a voice calling, "Save me." As the stranger looked, he could see a snake, a very big snake with a circle of fire that was dancing all around it, and the snake was trying to get out, but every way it turned, the fire was there. So the stranger bent the trunk of a young tree and climbed out over the fire until he could hold a branch down to the snake, and the snake wrapped himself around the branch, and the stranger pulled the snake up out of the fire. And as soon as the snake saw that he was free, he twined himself around the stranger and started to crush the life out of him. But the stranger shouted, "No, no, I am the one who has just saved your life, and you pay me back by trying to kill me." But the snake said, "I am keeping the law. It is the law that whoever does good receives evil in return." And he drew his coils tight around the stranger, but the stranger kept on saying, "No, no, I do not believe that is the law." So the snake said, "I will show you. I will show you 3 times and you will see." And he kept his coils tight around the stranger's neck and all around his arms and body. But he let go of the stranger's legs. "Now walk," he said to the stranger. "Keep going." So they started out that way, and they came to a river, and the river said to them, "I do good to everyone, and look what they do to me. I save them from dying of thirst, and all they do is stir up the mud and fill my water with dead things." The snake said, "1." The stranger said, "Let us go on," and they did, and they came to a karandai palm. There were wounds running with sap on its bark. There's a problem there. I'm going to interrupt right in the middle of the thing. Because people stop to think, what's a karandai palm? Well, if I told you the Latin name of it, which is a Copernicia alba, that wouldn't mean anything probably either. It's a fan palm of South America that has many uses, and the Guarani would have known this name for it. So, and there's no other translation for it, but except into Latin. The stranger said, "Let us go on," and they did, and they came to a karandai palm. There were wounds running with sap on its trunk, and the palm tree was moaning, "I do good to everyone, and look what they do to me. I give them my fruit and my shade, and they cut me and drink from my body until I die." The snake said, "Two." The stranger said, "Let us go on," and they did, and came to a place where they heard whimpering and saw a dog with his paw in a basket. And the dog said, "I did a good thing, and this is what came of it. I found a jaguar who had been hurt, and I took care of him, and he got better. And as soon as he had his strength again, he sprang at me, wanting to eat me up. I managed to get away, but he tore my paw. I hid in a cave until he was gone, and here in this basket I have a calabash full of milk for my wound, but now I have pushed it too far down to reach. Will you help me?" he said to the snake. And the snake liked milk better than anything, so he slid off the stranger and into the basket. And when he was inside, the dog snapped it shut and swung it against a tree with all his might, again and again, until the snake was dead. And after the snake was dead in there, the dog said to the stranger, "Friend, I have saved your life." And the stranger took the dog home with him and treated him the way the stranger would treat a dog. Hard-headed people of Guarani, I think. I want to read a poem about birds, shorebirds. This is very far from shorebirds, but you do get, I think as I remember, there are some gulls that come this far inland. Yeah. Shorebirds. While I think of them, they are growing rare. After the distances they have followed all the way to the end for the first time, tracing a memory they did not have until they set out to remember it, at an hour when all at once it was late and newly silent, and the white had turned white around them. Then they rose in their choir on a single note, each of them alone, between the pull of the moon and the hummed undertone of the earth below them. The glass curtains kept falling around them as they flew in search of their place before they were anywhere, and storms winnowed them. They flew among the places with towers and past the tower lights where some vanished with their long legs for wading in shadow. Others were caught and stayed in the countries of the nets and in the lands of the lime twigs, some fastened, and after the countries of guns at first light, fewer of them than I remember would be here to recognize the light of late summer when they found it, playing with darkness along the wet sand. Then a poem called Waves in August, which is a sort of poem that's moving toward some of the later poems. There is a war in the distance, with the distance growing smaller. The field glasses lying at hand are for keeping it far away. I thought I was getting better about that returning childish wish to be living somewhere else that I knew was impossible. And now I find myself wishing to be here, to be alive here. It is impossible enough to still be the wish of a child. In youth, I hid a boat under the bushes beside the water, knowing I would want it later and come back and would find it there. Someone else took it and left me instead the sound of the water with its whisper of vertigo, terror, reassurance, and old, old sadness. It would seem we knew enough always about parting, but we have to go on learning as long as there is anything. One more poem from the River Sound, and it's a poem called "The String," and it's the sort of linked poem with the manuscript, the unpublished manuscript that comes afterwards. Night, the black bead, a string running through it with the sound of a breath. Lights are still there from long ago when they were not seen. In the morning it was explained to me that the one we call the morning star and the evening star are the same. Well, the unpublished, you see, there was a chance you might have known some of those poems, and there's no chance that you would know any of these, but so you're on your own. I want to begin with the first poem. That was the last poem in the River Sound, and this is the first poem in the Pupil. Called Prophecy. At the end of the year, the stars go out. The air stops breathing, and the Sibyl sings. First, she sings of the darkness she can see. She sings on until she comes to the age without time and the dark she cannot see. No one hears then as she goes on singing of all the white days that were brought to us one by one, that turned to colors around us. A light coming from far out in the eye where it begins before she can see it, burns through the words that no one has believed. Many of the poems at the beginning of the Pupil, or first part of the Pupil, have to do with night, and night in various forms. And I want to read another of them. This one's called The Hours of Darkness. When there are words waiting in line once more, I find myself looking into the eyes of an old man I have seen before, who is holding a long white cane as he stares past my head, talking of poems and youth. After him a shadow, where I thought to see a face, asks, "Have you considered how often you return to the subject of not seeing, to the state of blindness, whether you name it or not? Do you intend to speak of that as often as you do? Do you mean anything by it?" I look up into the year that the Black Queen could still see, the year of the alien lights appearing to her and then going away with the others, the year of the well of darkness overflowing with no moon and no stars. It was there all the time behind the eye of day. Rumphius saw it before he had words for anything, long before he wrote of the hermit crab, "These wanderers live in the houses of strangers," wondering where they had come from. Vermeer in our time never saw any creature living or as a fossil, but can summon by touch the story of a cowrie 400 million years old, scars, ancestry, and what it knew in the dark sea. There Borges is talking about Milton's sonnet, and Milton hears the words of Samson to someone else, and Homer is telling of a landscape without horizons, and the blind knight, whom no one ever could touch with a sword, says, "In my head there is only darkness, so they never find me, but I know where they are." It is the light that appears to change and be many, to be today, to flutter as leaves, to recognize the rings of the trees, to come again. One of the stars is from the day of the cowrie. One is from a time in the garden. We see the youth of the light in all its ages. We see it as bright points of animals made long ago out of night. How small the day is, the time of colors, the rush of brightness. And a related poem that I want to read, because it's not exactly this part of the world, but it's a part of the world that we will know about. It's not far. It's only about 5 hours drive from here, but called the Marfa Lights. Are they there in the daytime, east of town on the way to Paisano Pass, rising unseen by anyone, climbing in long arcs over Mitchell Flat, candles at noon being carried by hands never named, never caught on film, never believed, as they go up the long stairs of the light to glide in secret or dance along the dazzling halls out of sight, above where the air shimmers like a sea. Only when the curtain of light is fading thin above the black glass mountains and the first stars are glittering do the claims of sightings begin. They may occur from anywhere facing the removes of those broken horizons, though most of them nowadays are likely to come from somewhere on Route 90 looking south toward the Chinatis. A marker has been set up by the road there, and cars begin to stop before sundown, pulling over into the lay-by, designated with rim rocks. Folding chairs are unlimbered while there is still light and positioned among the piled stones at spots, expecting them as niches along sea cliffs expect their old fishermen. Tripods are set up and telescopes. They all seem to know what they are waiting for. Then buses with lines of faces peering over each other at the windows. At one time out there was the place to take a date. It used to mean something different if you said you had been out to see the lights. But almost everybody had seen them, whether or not they had seen just the same things. And all were shadowed by the same explanations. There were reports of those lights before there were cars or ranches. They were seen over wagon trains on their way up from the valley and seen shining above the bare moving forests of cattle horns in the pass. Sometimes a light would drift and swell and suddenly shudder and fly up, bursting apart from one color to another. Some say they will turn out to be something simple, a trick of the atmosphere, and some do not think they are anything, insisting that people will believe whatever they want to, in the same way that herdsmen and cowhands in the Chinatis for 100 years would whisper that the lights were the ghost of the war chief Alsate, who had been captured and dragged off to his death and his followers sold into slavery. Of course, by now there have been investigations, inconclusive until the present, telling us in our turn what we do not know, what the evidence amounts to, perhaps, and how far the theories have gone to suggest what these bright appearances portend in the eye of the mind, where we know from the beginning that the darkness is beyond us. There is no explaining the dark. It is only the light that we keep feeling a need to account for. I'm going to read a very formal poem of a very different kind, because it's something that I was recently given by pure, well, whatever accident it is, but coincidence, CD of Myra Hess playing Beethoven and Schumann and Schubert and Bach. And of course, Myra Hess, during World War II, played many, many, many free concerts at the National Gallery and in the park, and at the time of the Blitz and in the days between the Blitz. It was her contribution. And I was thinking of Myra Hess. She was one of the people I was thinking of when I was writing this poem, but long before I'd heard this CD. Overtone. Some listening were certain they could hear through the notes summoned from the strings, one more following at a distance, low but clear, a resonance never part of the score. Not noticed during the rehearsals nor played into the performance, and yet here with the first note it had been waiting for, holding silent the iced minors of fear, the key of grief, the mourning from before the names were read of those no longer there. That sound of what made no sound anymore. All formed the chords that in a later year some still believed that they could overhear. Echoing music, played during a war. I've been haunted for years by the thought of listening to those concerts, knowing what was happening all around, and the hearing Schubert and Mozart and Beethoven, and the thing that everybody remembered was her playing Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, between two nights of heavy bombardment by the Luftwaffe. Since that's a poem, I was thinking about London. I want to read a poem, a different kind of poem altogether, called Plagne, which is an Occitan word for an elegy, usually for kings and poets. Plagne for the death of Ted Hughes, who was one of my close friends. There were so many streets then in London. They were always going to be there. There were more than enough to go all the way. There were so many days to walk through them. We would be back with the time of year just as we were in the open day. There were so many words as we went on walking, sometimes 3 of us, sometimes 2. Half the sentences flying unfinished as we turned up the collars that had been through the wars. Autumn in the park, spring on the hill, winter on the bridges under what we started to say. There was so much dew even in Boston, even in the bright fall, so many planets poised on the sills of transparent houses. It was coming to pass around us the whole time before it happened, before the hearts stopped one after the other and the silent wailing began that would not end. We were going to catch up with some of the sentences in France or Idaho. We were going to shake them out again and listen to what had not been caught by history or geography or touched at all by the venomous weather. It was only a question of where and when. I'd like to end with some poems that are more recent than that manuscript. And most of these poems, in fact, all the ones I'm going to read are poems in the second person. They're addressed to, in some cases, I think, quite unlikely things, abstractions, places, anything. This one is to absence. Raw shore of paradise, which the long waves reach just as they fail, one after the other. Bare strand beyond which at times I believe I see as in a glass darkly what I know here and now cannot be. A face I can never touch, a gaze that cannot stay, which I catch sight of still turned upon me, following me from under the sky of your groundless country that has no syllable of its own. What good to you are the treasures beyond words or number that you seize forever, unmapped imperium, when only here in the present which has not lost them, only now in the moment you have not yet taken, does anyone know them or how rare they are? I said unlikely. This is one addressed to my teeth. So the companions of Ulysses, those that were still with him after the night in the horse, the sea lanes, the other islands, the friends lost one by one in pain, and the coming home one bare day to a later age that was their own, but with their scars now upon them, and now darkened and worn, and some broken beyond recognition, and still missing the ones taken away from beside them who had grown up with them and served long without question, wanting nothing else, sat around in the old places across from the hollows, reminding themselves that they were the lucky ones, together where they belonged. But would he stay there? We lost beloved dog in June, and she was getting older, and at the latter part of the day, I had become accustomed to putting a leash around her and taking her for a walk far out in the garden to make sure that she had a walk every day, because she was getting arthritic and didn't like to walk, but she would walk along with me with the leash, and then I would let her go and let her come back alone. And this is just addressed to that walk that we took every night, to Lily's walk. Strange that now there should be no sign of you visible on the dusty way between the shadows where the morning light comes through to lie across those places we have been time and again, though at the other end of the day when the sun was nearly gone, and from the other side the beams lengthened under the trees where you came setting one foot down carefully before the other, weaving upstream along with me to where we would go no farther than together. And I said, you know the way back from there. I will wait and you can follow alone. And between us the night has come and gone. A few more of these. To lingering regrets. Without wanting to, I have come slowly to admit that I know who you are one by one, O lovely and mournful with downcast eyes, appearing to me as you are turning away to stand silent and late in a remembered light, touched with amber as the sun is going from a day that it brought. You come to me again and again to wait, as beautiful as ever at the edge of the light. You have not changed at all as far as I can tell, and you learn nothing from me who do not talk with you, but see you waiting there without once moving toward you, O forever hopeful and forever young. You are the foolish virgins, with no oil for your lamps, and no one else to lead you where you want to go. I'll read two more, but I have to find one. To the knife. You were what made us cry in the light to start with. We could see you were there, and we saw what you were. We were hiding from you and would have been happy to go on with the dream that you could not find us. Cold flame, sight without eyes, line where both shores, the seen and the unseen, come down into nothing, to pass between, to separate, to open, to divide what had been once from what once it had been, to tell apart, bringing always the touch of the present, though the dread of you flares up far ahead of you, and the memory of you lingers and goes on burning ahead of you. We plead with you who have no ears for us. We beg in private and in vain, do not see us at all. Ever. We are not here. Or if you see us, do not touch us wherever you were going to touch us. Or if you do touch us, divide us from something it would be good to lose, and save us for ourselves. And finally, appropriately, to the mistakes. You are the ones who were not recognized in time, although you may have been waiting in full sight in broad day from the first step that set out toward you. And although you may have been prophesied, hung round with warnings, had your big pictures in all the papers, yet in the flesh you did not look like that. Each of you in turn seemed like no one else. You are the ones who are really my own, never will leave me forever after, or ever belong to anyone else. You are the ones who I must have needed, the ones who led me in spite of all that was said about you placing my footsteps on the only way. Thank you.
William, that was wonderful reading. Thank you.
It's a wonderful introduction. That's what did the whole thing.
I was interested in the repeated references tonight to all that is not known, because that was something I really wanted to talk about with you. And perhaps this has to do with the season, once again. You have said the two sides of existence are always there in a poem. There's what you know, but the source is what you don't know. I've also heard you say all poetry comes from listening. What you're listening for is what you don't know. Sometimes it seems that what we don't know is hardly what culture respects most, or headlines, public dialogue. A few years ago, I was very taken with the Szymborska poem where she talks about how much that simple phrase, I don't know, could help us if we would only trust in it as human beings. And it seems in your poems that you have trusted in it and allowed it to lead you so many places. Would you be willing?
Well, I've felt for a long time, and you know, if you have these notions, they tend to, and if they're really yours, they tend to go on growing with you. I've had the feeling that what we know is very, very remarkable, but it's a very tiny part of this enormous universal thing of what, not only what we don't know, but what we never will know, and what is indeed, in every sense that we understand it, unknowable. I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not going to put it in metaphysical, in nice metaphysical terms. But the ways we tend to think of ourselves, and the things that we use and need to use practically for everything in our lives involve what we know. We need what we know. We need to respect what we know. We need to pay attention to it. We need a good education plan. We need all of these things, you know. But finally, it's what a great Chinese master said in the 9th century. He said, it's like a hair floating in empty space. I mean, it's so small. It's so little. And it's it's also very deceptive, because what you know can hide what you don't know and make you think that it's the real thing, and it isn't. It's only an aspect of the real thing. It's something that allows you to have a relation with the real thing, but it isn't the real thing itself. The real thing is always what you don't know. It's always this immense unknown that frightens us, you know, that we know it chiefly as something that is frightening. And of course, what we think of as the ultimate unknown, we think of death, you know, as being the ultimate unknown. It is, but it's only, even death is only part of the unknown, and this is so enormous that we can't envisage it. And the imagination, which goes beyond knowledge, it moves closer to the unknown, and of course comes out of the unknown.
You mentioned the fear. Do you think that fear is what causes so many people, whether in poetry or in other kinds of lives, to back away from the unknown, or say, I'll hold to that little hair and I won't listen to the other? I think
so, yeah, because of course uncertainty is the beginning of the unknown. The recognition of uncertainty. Uncertainty is the recognition of the beginning of the unknown. And if you're not on good terms with it, if you're full of anxiety anyway, that's where your anxiety begins. I mean, that's the ocean of your panic and of your fright and so forth. And but there are other ways of approaching it, and I think that it's one of the salutary things about the arts is that the arts are dealing with the unknown in quite a different way. They're saying it's okay, you know, you can you can treat the unknown as, you can regard the unknown as not God the Father, but as a great mother, that says, it's, it's going to be all right. There's some, you didn't know where it came from in the first place, and look what you got. And you don't know where it's going, and don't figure that you have to know too much. There's a wonderful thing in part of the Pali Canon where one of the students says to the Buddha, "I'm going to leave you, Master." And he said, "Why are you going to leave me?" He said, "Well, you haven't told us about whether there's a life after death. You haven't told us about all these different things, but particularly about whether there's life after death." And the Buddha says, "Did I ever say that I would tell you about life after death?" "Well, no, you didn't say that." "And did I ever tell you that I would tell you these other things?" "No, you didn't say that you were going to say that. But I wanted to know." "Well," he said, "the reason I didn't tell you was because you don't need to know those things. What you need to know is what I've told you."
It's wonderful. It's really nice. Could you talk a little bit about your form, how it's grown, and through the known and the unknown of all the forms that you have worked with? In the early poems, the very earliest poems, the very formal, tightly managed, wonderfully adept forms, and then moving to a more open line, internal spacing, the lyric, the narrative coming back in. It seems to me that very few poets have been as diverse as you have been in terms of the passage through different forms and respecting them and working with them, but finding your own distinctive form and really maintaining an allegiance to it. And I think all of the poems, even if they may have different lengths and different kinds of topics, but there has been a voice that is so much yours. And yet it's not necessarily the voice one would have heard in the first few books.
I'm obviously fascinated by the formal aspect of poetry, and I think of poetry, I think of the form, in I suppose quite unorthodox ways. I think that the formal possibilities of poetry at any point are infinite. I mean, they're not. I've always shied away from anybody, and as you know, in my generation, there have been a number of people who would say it has to be this kind of poem or it isn't a poem, and it has to be formal or it has to be not formal or it has to be this or that. It has to have such and such and such. And they're all wrong. I mean, it doesn't have to be any of those things. It has to be something probably that it will determine by itself. But I think that's true of forms too. I think that the formal possibilities are infinite. We only know a few of them, and that there's no such thing as a bad form. They become conventional, they become habitual, and they blunt the way habits always do. But I think that a poem for me eventually determines the form that it's going to have. It may start out in one form and then say, no, that's not right. It's supposed to be a different kind of form. I love disguising forms and making it seem to be informal when in fact it's very formal. And I believe also that two things about it I've come to realize.
That's a form.
I believe that a form is a liberation. It's not a sort of it's not a straitjacket. If you find that it's a straitjacket, it's not a form. It's just you're torturing yourself. There's no reason to do that. But actually, a real form brings out things that in the subject that would not have been brought out in another way. And Baudelaire said, if you find that meter and rhyme, he was talking about it in a very conventional way, but if you find that meter and rhyme are consistently working against you, you probably aren't a poet. You probably want to do it some other way. In fact, I mean, there's a very formal poet of my generation, a year older than I, James Merrill, who died a few years ago, whose poetry I admire enormously. And I feel close enough in some ways to some of James's poems to look at lines and figure that I can sort of guess passages of evolution of how that line came to be there, But it's the formality that makes it possible. But the other side of it is that if it happens, if it works, that's no reason to think it's going to work again, you know. And if you start deciding that because it worked, it's going to work again, then it's certainly going to work against you, and you're going to go deaf to it, and you better pay attention to the next poem and say, do you want to be that kind of form, or do you want to be something else, you know?
I still very much like something you said in 1969 in the Naked Poetry Anthology, where you said, what are called here open forms are in some concerns the strictest. Here only the poem itself can be seen as its form. I like that. You still like that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know whether I like that, but I think that.
You still think that. Young readers discovering your poems, and I've enjoyed being with many teenagers who read your poems for the first time, and that feeling of wanting to clutch the pages to their hearts and carry them with them everywhere is one that we all can appreciate. But one thing they often want to talk about is the beautiful lack of cluttered punctuation in your poems, since it's often something they've had trouble with in their own writing. But of course they can see that what you're doing with it is not simply abandoning it, but using the space, the sense of the air around the space, around the poem, as another kind of punctuation. And so there really is punctuation, but it's not with commas and periods, semicolons, so forth. Do you still like that image about punctuation being staples holding the poem to the page, and without it the poem has a larger life?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I think in the first place I think of not using which, by the way, that it's not a credo. I don't think that other people should abandon. I don't know whether they should or shouldn't. I mean,
right.
That's up to them.
Well, many want to when they.
I hope it looks easy.
It's not. It's very hard. It's very hard.
But the thing that I realized as I came to it was that writing without punctuation was in itself a form. That it is a form. It has a formal demand, and one of the formal demands is that if you don't have punctuation, you have to do it in another way. And how you do it is by the movement and sound of the language. But it has to be the spoken and heard language.
That's right.
It is not. It pulls it away from prose, right. And punctuation, after all, really is the protocol of prose.
That's right.
And that's not to say anything bad about it. I mean, it's a very valuable thing, and when I write prose, I use it. And I hope I use it all right. But it's actually it's a mixture of philosophy and manners, so punctuation. But grammar is pure philosophy. But it is also, to me, represented always something that I feel very strongly, which is that poetry is physical in the sense that prose may or may not be. It doesn't have to be. You have to hear poetry. If you don't hear Shakespeare, I don't know how some scholars manage to read Shakespeare all their lives and clearly have never heard it at all. You know, I mean, I've heard a few times scholars talk about Shakespeare, and I don't think you've ever heard a thing. I mean, I don't know why you're teaching or studying Shakespeare. Is there no passion in this thing? And the passion it's physical. It comes from hearing it. And the strange thing about poetry that I don't understand is that it begins with a sense. It begins with one of the senses. It doesn't begin with the mind. It begins with hearing something. I mean, writing a poem for me begins with, and then reading a poem. There are poems of Yeats and poems of Blake and other poems that I got to the point of memorizing, and I didn't really know what they were doing. But I sort of heard something as I read them, and I couldn't stop hearing it. And that to me, it's a kind of mantric power that is in that language. And it doesn't have anything to do with punctuation, and it doesn't have, but it has to do with hearing.
And hearing, as opposed to, say, starting out with an idea. That's not where poetry begins for you. No.
I think that hearing is something that and hearing is something that you hear not only with your ears, but then you begin to hear it with your whole body. I mean, vibration did you pick up?
Even as a child, were you reading what you wrote out loud to yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Always. Was someone else reading poetry to you
My
as well?
mother read Robert Louis Stevenson and Tennyson's The Brook, and I'm afraid Longfellow. I don't mean to put down Longfellow, but the things that we know of Longfellow are really sort of too bad. It's too bad that anybody's remembered for those. But if you want to go, but read his sonnets about Chaucer. They're beautiful, and they're lovely things, and they're lovely lines and passages in Longfellow. And his translation of Dante is probably one of the better translations of Dante. But
So that spoken sound of poetry was always with you from early on.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes, I can still remember. I mean, listening to Stevenson's. I still think that "Where Go the Boats" is one of the most beautiful poems in English,
And you memorized many poems when you were young.
yeah,
That you retain.
yeah. Don't you know that poem? I mean,
Not by
dark
memory.
brown is the
Yes.
river, golden is the sand.
Mm-hmm.
It flows along forever with trees on either hand.
It's a loss not to be doing that in schools, don't you
Well, the
think?
little time that I taught, I insisted that people find poems that they liked, and then memorize them, and then tell us why from memory they like those poems.
The little times that you taught, you never had a strong desire to teach, and you were able to live without doing it. And
Well,
I think many people admire that in you.
So, you ever remember those old Disney films of Dippy walking off from the cliff, not realizing that he's in midair? Yeah, it was kind of like that. But no, it wasn't that I had a thing against teaching. Although I was very cautious about teaching when I was, in my 20s and 30s. But at which I was cautious about an academic career and about getting caught in one. And I watched my contemporaries doing that and getting caught in an academic path, let's say, and not being able to see themselves any other way. Mm-hmm. And they began to get, have house payments and mortgages and things like that, and I lived without any of those things, sort of hand to mouth. And I had a different set of examples in mind. I mean, I was thinking of the composers and poets of before the 20th century, who never thought they were going to have any money, and I thought, well, I won't ever have any money. But this is what I really want to do.
And you've been so generous with all the translation. I think many people would have feared that it would take away time from their own writing, and yet you were always committed to it very early on through translating other people's work. So did it function for you not only as something that you believed in, a dedication, but as a way of clearing your own pipes and keeping you alive to language in general for your own writing?
I think it did all kinds of things like that. As for time, I mean, I probably didn't spend more time translating than many of my contemporaries spent being academic, writing papers and publishing or perishing and teaching. But I had this urge to find poetry of any kind, and even sometimes reading translations of non-literate languages. It was like listening for something very far away that you might just get a few notes of, but if they were real, And I was just so fascinated by all these different kinds of poetry, because I felt that poetry had to be of many, many kinds, and there must be many ways of trying to make this impossible thing happen in language.
And sometimes you had to collaborate with other people because you didn't speak all of the languages necessarily, but many times you did speak the languages. So was that a different process?
Yeah, it was. And translation, of course, is I don't think one can say it too often. I mean, when people say to you with a smile, well, of course, it's impossible to translate poetry, isn't it? You say, of course it is,
Say, no, it's not.
Absolutely impossible. But that's not. But we don't do it because it's possible. We do it because it's necessary, and because it's unthinkable that we wouldn't do it. That we have to try to do this.
And because we're always translating everything to begin with, aren't we?
Yeah. And the Dante. I mean, all my life I said you can't translate Dante. I mean, I tried to read. I carried Dante around in my pocket for years, in a bilingual edition, and memorized long things of Dante. I thought you can't. But his translation's ridiculous. And when I was asked to translate some Dante, I said, "Well, I've always said you can't do it." And that I tried, and nobody. Of course, you can't do it, but you can get closer. You can give. I mean, at least I hope you can. I wanted a translation always to convey some idea of why the original was worth translating. And there are many bad translations that don't. I mean, you think, well, if the original is anyway like that, why bother to translate it? It's so boring. Something must show you, whether it's the meaning or the sound or the originality of the thought. But I mean, it's not this boring thing that we're trying to plow through. And you have to do it differently.
And you never found it eroding your own sense of time for your own work, did you?
I suppose I did occasionally, and sometimes it was one of my ways of earning a living too, translating. Because I mean, you can translate for money. I don't know that you can write. I can't imagine writing poems for money, but it's a strange idea. But you could translate for money.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You actually became close to many of the people whom you translated, didn't you? Get to know them.
Some of them I became close to. Some of them I met only a few times, and one of the ones that I wish I'd known a lot better was Jean Follin, a French poet who was born in 1903, and Copper Canyon's going to reprint his book of poems of his. He was a wonderful poet, and I think underrated. I mean, the French don't realize how wonderful a poet Follin was. He was that same generation as Michaud and Éluard and Satie and the composers in Paris, and not the first great breakthrough, not Apollinaire's generation, but sort of 10 years or 15 years younger than that. And I think he's a very beautiful and very, very original poet, and very un-French in some ways.
In a recent poem of yours, The Wild, which I read only recently, I think it's a fairly recent poem, The Wild, where you talk about seeing the water through the trees, mm-hmm. and that sense of it, that image enduring through the years. It made me think about how William Stafford used to talk about those images in our childhoods which lean us toward poetry, if not telling us for sure that's what we'll do, giving us a sense that there's something out there worth yearning for, worth carrying, worth shaping into language. And I feel that many of your poems have helped us feel those images through your whole life, through what those images have been. Are there any particular ones from your childhood that you haven't written about much, but which you can continue to return to in your mind?
Yeah, there are. Camus said that we'll return to a very small number of dominating images, and every writer does that. And there are ones to do with people, but there's one that I think of often, and I have written about it, but I don't think I've ever conveyed it. I remember there was a farm that we used to go to when I was about 8 or 9, and it was a very kind of repressed childhood. But my mother and the woman, the farm woman who'd come there from somewhere else, were talking one afternoon. I was allowed to go for a walk by myself on the farm, and I remember the entire walk, and I remember finding my way out through the farm over the hill and over another hill, and then all of a sudden coming over this hilltop and seeing something. It was like a vision. I mean, I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. It was just this enormous, great pasture flowing down into woods with the late afternoon light, and just utterly silent. And it was really like seeing another dimension of existence. And I went back and tried to, I stood there for a long time, then I went back and tried to explain what I'd seen, and of course completely failed to do that. And I've still completely failed to do that.
I don't think so. But I think that's the feeling looking this pasture that people feel when they read your poems, maybe. I think so.
You do.
They've walked up to that place. No, many people. I'm taking a poll, I know. Recently you were asked an interesting question for a project, I think happening off the coast of Seattle. What poems by other poets, a few, you might select to put in places such as military submarines or enterprises where people are kind of at a pitch of high alert tension, and what would be some other poems by people you would choose to put there? And could you tell us about one you selected?
Well, yeah. The letter said that this was someone who was working, selling for a bookstore, books for the Puget Sound, for several Navy yards, and he'd been informed that the Trident submarine had a small library. Everyone did. What he may not even know, but my wife and I know, because we were involved in a controversy to keep our county in Hawaii a nuclear-free zone, is that when a Trident submarine dives, it will stay submerged for 90 days. So that one's completely out of touch with any time except Greenwich time, and with the surface, and there's no radio contact. There wasn't during that time. So I mean, the psychological strain is enormous on the people down there. What were the poems? He said, I realize that it's ideas that make people push buttons. What books should they have on those shelves that might make them wonder about pushing the buttons? So the books are one thing. There's a list of 5 books he asked me to send. And the poems that I thought of sending, the 2 that I and didn't, were Shakespeare's Fear No More, The Heat of the Sun, because I thought no one could push a button, whoever listens to that poem. And Dylan Thomas's great refusal to mourn the death by fire of a child in London, which I think is one of the great war poems ever written. And but because I thought those 2 poems, for their language, were difficult of access. But there was William Stafford's Earth Dwellers. It's one beautiful poem. And mostly they were very contemporary poems. Gerald Stern's The Dog. Hans Magnus Enzensberger's I Speak for None of Your Kind, I Speak for the Owls. And there's one I'm not remembering, but the 5th one was Emily Dickinson's I Reason Earth is Short, and Pain is Absolute, and Many Hurt.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
But what of that? Yeah.
All the clods become precious in that Stafford
that's
poem.
The Stafford poem.
All the clods. Just one last thing I'd like. Well, many last things, many first things, last things, but one thing I'm curious about, and I realize this is a hard question to answer, but I think it's one that many poets wonder or need to wonder. In the midst of all the places you've lived and all the poets you've lived among and all the people you've known, you have retained, and we can tell you this even though it's not a kind of thing one would admit oneself, an amazing lack of just big self. You've maintained a humility, a kindness, a sense that you have served poetry in the way that it deserves to be served, and it has served you, therefore. There's been this interaction. And I'm curious what guiding signs you might suggest to poets caught up in the whirl, the clamor of their own selfhood or their own quest to be known or to share their work, or all the questions that people ask poets. What guiding things would you say to them to remember?
Well, I've thought of this many times, you know, having to talk to students and to children, students of different ages, and thinking I'm not very good at this. I'm not particularly wise nor experienced or any of these things. But the thing that I know is that you must respect find out what you really want to do and respect that and pay attention to that. Not pay attention only to other people's expectations. And of course, not everybody can do this. Not everybody has the freedom to do it. But I really think, I remember years ago hearing of something that Bertrand Russell said when he was an older man. He said, if a poet cannot be independent, nobody on earth can be independent. And I thought, that's interesting. That means what he doesn't know, what even that philosopher doesn't realize that he said is that a poet is responsible for being independent, because the poet is a guardian of independence, and you have to give an example of doing it the way that you believe it has to be done, because maybe nobody else can do it. You have to speak for people who cannot. You have to speak for any kind of life that cannot speak for itself. And you have to try to maintain that kind of freedom if you can, because it's not in self-indulgence. It's the important thing. It's paying attention.
Thank you for doing just that from all of us.
And it was basically the same people too.
Well, I've known Merwin's work about 10 years, and I've spent a lot of time in the desert. And he's got this poem called Air, which he didn't read tonight, but it says, "This must be what I wanted to be doing, walking at night between the two deserts, singing." And it's like this acceptance in him, and a sort of I find in his work a sort of surrealistic power, where the words seem to flow together, pause at odd junctures, stumble, and then flow onwards.
Saying in the early 70s, why was his work influential on you?
Well, there was a whole change in language in poetry at that time, and in the use of imagery, what we call the free image suddenly took over, and Merwin was at the lead of that. I remember his poem, "The Way to the River." You had the opening line, "The way to the river leads past the names of ass, the sleeves, the reeds of the bandage bender." All these images were free and open, and suddenly it changed the rhythms of American language.
I first met Mr. Merwin 20 years ago. It was in New York. I was the general manager of the theater at Lincoln Center, and we had commissioned Mr. Merwin to do a translation of Lorca's Yerma. And it was an absolutely exquisite, breathtaking translation. And exquisite describes his poetry for me. It's a great honor, a privilege to present W.S. Merwin.
Thank you, Alan. I think it's the first time that I've ever read in Los Angeles proper. And I think as a result of that, instead of doing what I would normally do, which is to read in more or less chronological order, I'm going to start with a poem that has to do with Los Angeles by name, because most of the city poems that I've written have to do with New York, where I was born, and which to me is a kind of archetypical or archetypal city and the kind of model of history. But you know, New Yorkers take a, if I'm a New Yorker, and I'm not sure about that, I was born there, but they have very ambivalent feelings about the other coast. This poem is called Late Wonders. In Los Angeles, the cars are flowing through the white air and the news of bombings. At Universal Studios, you can ride through an avalanche if you have never ridden through an avalanche. With your ticket, you can ride on a trolley before which the Red Sea parts, just the way it did for Moses. You can see Los Angeles destroyed hourly. You can watch the avenue named for somewhere else, the one on which you know you are, crumple and vanish incandescent with a terrible cry all around you, rising from the houses and families of everyone you have seen all day, driving, shopping, talking, eating. It's only a movie. It's only a beam of light. I want to jump a long way back chronologically and read a poem that was written in the 50s. A very different kind of poem, also in a way about a beam of light. It's a poem called One Eye, and it's taken, it begins with the proverb, the sort of epigraph is the proverb, in the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. On that vacant day, after kicking and moseying here and there for some time, he lifted that carpet corner his one eyelid, and the dyed light leapt at him from all sides like dogs. Also, hues that he had never dreamed of in that place were bleeding and playing. Even so, it was only at the grazing of light fingers over his face unannounced, and then his sight of many matte eyes, paired white irises like dried peas looking, that it dawned on him his sidelong idling had found the country of the blind, whose swarming digits knew him at once, their king, come to them out of a saying, and chanting an anthem unto his one eye, to the dry accompaniment that their leaping fingers made flicking around him like locusts in a cloud, they took him home with him. Their shapely city shines like a suit. On a plain chair he was set in a cloak of hands and crowned to intricate music. They sent him their softest daughters, clad only in scent and their own vast ears, meantime making different noises in each antechamber. They can be wakened sometimes by a feather falling on the next floor, and they keep time by the water clocks dropping even when they sleep. Once he would expound to them all from his only light, day breaking, the sky spiked and the earth amuck with color, and they would listen, amazed at his royalty, gaping like sockets, and would agree, blank as pearls at the beginning. Alone in brightness, soon he spoke of it in sleep only. Look, look, he would call out, in the dark only. Now in summer, gaudy with birds, he says nothing. Of their thefts often beheld, and their beauties, now for a long time, nothing. Nothing day after day, to see the black thumb as big as a valley, over their heads descending silently out of a quiet sky. I want to jump to an animal poem called Fly, about a bird. I have been cruel to a fat pigeon because he would not fly. All he wanted was to live like a friendly old man. He had let himself become a wreck, filthy and confiding, wild for his food, beating the cat off the garbage, ignoring his mate, perpetually snotty at the beak, smelling, waddling, having to be carried up the ladder at night, content. Fly, I said, throwing him into the air, but he would drop and run back, expecting to be fed. I said it again and again, throwing him up as he got worse. He let himself be picked up every time until I found him in the dovecote, dead of the needless efforts. So that is what I am. Pondering his eye that could not conceive that I was a creature to run from, I who have always believed too much in words.
You said you believe too much in words. I mean, is that an exaggeration, or do you think that's really true?
Oh, I think it's true. I meant it in many senses. I mean, I'm believing too much in words in that you can become hypnotized by language so that you mistake the language for the thing it's talking about. You pay more attention to the words themselves than what they refer to. You know, the story about the finger pointing at the moon. I mean, you mistake the finger for the moon. But there's also the implication that I've been too caught up with the actual thing of using words, of being defined by speech itself, which I think we all tend to do. You know, I mean, we define our own species as the species that speaks, that uses language, which is only partly true. I mean, many other species use language of a different kind. We use verbal language, and we use it with a great deal more of intensity and complexity than any other species uses verbal language. But the languages of other species, as we now know, are far more developed than we realized even half a century ago.
Do you ever think that? Do you ever use words as a way to hypnotize yourself? I mean, I think that's one of the functions of speech.
Well, I think that's an aspect of poetry always. You know, I think it can become a very boring aspect of poetry. I think, you know, Swinburne can put you to sleep because there's a kind of soporific thing to a lot of Swinburne. But the other side of that is the kind of mantric aspect of poetry, and that's present all the way through Dante. I mean, the power of Dante's lines is very often a kind of mantric power. If you take those lines and really start saying the line over and over, there's a sort of dimension that comes out of the darkness and begins to light the whole thing up. And I think that's present in most poetry. It's not present in prose very often. I want to read a very different kind of poem, an overtly mythological poem, and from Greek mythology. It refers to the Trojan War. Actually, it wasn't Homer who wrote it, although it's part of the material that Homer used. I think it explains itself, so I don't have to tell anything about it for those of you who are unfamiliar with that little-known work. The Judgment of Paris. Long afterwards, the intelligent could deduce what had been offered and not recognized. And they suggest that bitterness should be confined to the fact that the gods chose for their arbiter a mind and character so ordinary, albeit a prince, and brought up as a shepherd, a calling he must have liked, for he had returned to it when they stood before him, the three, naked, feminine, deathless, and he realized that he was clothed in nothing but mortality, the strap of his quiver of arrows crossing between his nipples, making it seem stranger. And he knew he must choose, and on that day. The one with the gray eyes spoke first, and whatever she said he kept thinking he remembered, but remembered it woven with confusion and fear. The two faces that he called father, the first sight of the palace where the brothers were strangers and the dogs watched him and refused to know him. She made everything clear. She was dazzling. She offered it to him to have for his own. But what he saw was the scorn above her eyes. And her words, of which he understood few, all said to him, "Take wisdom, take power. You will forget anyway." The one with the dark eyes spoke, and everything she said he imagined he had once wished for, but in confusion and cowardice. The crown of his father, the crowns bowing to him, his name everywhere like grass, only he and the sea triumphant. She made everything sound possible. She was dazzling. She offered it to him to hold high, but what he saw was the cruelty around her mouth. And her words, of which he understood more, all said to him, "Take pride, take glory. You will suffer anyway." The one the color of whose eyes later he could not remember spoke last and slowly and of desire, and it was his. Though up until then he had been happy with his river nymph, here was his mind filled utterly with one girl gathering yellow flowers and no one like her. The words made everything seem present, almost present. Present. They said to him, "Take her. You will lose her anyway." It was only when he reached out to the voice, as though he could take the speaker herself, that his hand filled with something to give, but to give to only one of the three. An apple, as it is told, discord itself in a single fruit, its skin already carved, to the fairest. Then a mason working above the gates of Troy in the sunlight thought he felt the stone shiver. In the quiver on Paris's back, the head of the arrow for Achilles' heel smiled in its sleep. And Helen stepped from the palace to gather, as she would do every day in that season, from the grove the yellow ray flowers tall as herself, whose roots are said to dispel pain. This is a poem called The Unwritten. There are a number of poems that run through these. These are poems of the late 60s and early 70s. And there are a number of poems about writing, but this is one about the unwritten. Inside this pencil crouch words that have never been written, never been spoken, never been taught. They're hiding. They're awake in there, dark in the dark, hearing us, but they won't come out. Not for love, not for time, not for fire. Even when the dark has worn away, they'll still be there, hiding in the air. Multitudes in days to come may walk through them, breathe them, be none the wiser. What script can it be that they won't unroll? In what language? Would I recognize it? Would I be able to follow it, to make out the real names of everything? Maybe there aren't many. It could be that there's only one word and it's all we need. It's here in this pencil. Every pencil in the world is like this. I think poetry came as language came. I think that, and you know, this thing about being too much involved in words doesn't mean that I think words should be rejected or can be dispensed with. I just think that when the distinction between words and one's use of them and what they're used for and what they refer to, when those distinctions break down, then the words are using you. You're not using the words anymore. You know.
Is that necessarily a bad thing, that the words use you?
I think it is. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Then I think you're lost in a world of your own references. You can never see the world. All you can see is your references.
I guess I'm thinking of, again, of
The
that
world
mantric.
is there. I mean, the ferns don't call themselves ferns. You know?
Yeah, but I'm thinking in terms of that of a mantric idea of words. I mean, so that really the words are out ahead of you in a way, or the
But
word.
you know what happens with a mantra? The words disappear.
Have you ever had that desire in your work? I mean, for the words to disappear. I mean, so that it is pure sound, or.
Well, when they disappear in a poem, I don't think what you're left with is pure sound. You're left with something else. You know?
What?
You may be left face to face with the subject itself.
Do you think poems have subjects?
Yeah, I do. And the contemporary theory, which you know very well, that it says there's several theories that say they don't have subjects and they don't need subjects. Then the not needing subjects becomes a subject. I mean, you don't pay attention to something that doesn't have a subject. You don't pay attention to a human artifact that has no subject. You know? What is there to pay attention to? I want to read two poems about insects. There seem to be a number of poems about insects. This one was written when I was living in southern Mexico and having a certain amount to do with the 5 nations of Indians that were around the city where I was living, up in the mountains, and with their stories and myths. And there were stories and myths about all kinds of creatures, real and imagined, but I noticed that there were some that never got spoken about. And when I went to the very cold movie, it was in the winter, and when I went to the cold movie house, sometimes it would be crowded and sometimes there would be nobody, depending on how good or bad the film was. Usually if the film was bad, it was crowded, and if it was good, there was nobody, you know, in my view. But there were always fleas. And I thought, strange, you know, nobody has anything to say about fleas. So I thought I would try to do something about that. And there's a poem, the Indians in the mountains refer to themselves, they carry everything on a tump from their forehead, and they refer to themselves as carrying men. And so this would be a fleas carrying song. It's a fleas carrying words. A flea is carrying a bag of diseases, and he says as he goes, "These I did not make myself. We don't all have the same gifts. Beginning isn't everything. I don't even know who made them. I don't know who'll use them. I don't use them myself. I just do what's in front of me, as I'm supposed to. I carry them. Nobody likes me. Nobody wants to change places with me. But I don't mind. I get away, bag and all. Something needs me. Everything needs me. I need myself. And the fire is my father." And the other one is called Flies. I mean, one didn't. They're written about the same time, you know. And this is a sort of myth about flies, a sort of homemade myth, you know. On the day when the flies were made, death was a garden, already without walls, without apples, with nowhere to look back to. All that day the stars could be seen, black points in the eyes of flies, and the only sound was the roar of the flies until the sun went down. Each day after that, something else was made, and something else with no name was a garden, which the flies never saw. What they saw was not there, with no end, no apples, ringed with black stars that no one heard, and they flew in it happily all day, wearing mourning. The book that followed that, it began with a number of poems that they came right after the death of my mother, and there are a number of poems that have to do with that. I want to read two of them. One's called The Snow. You with no fear of dying, how you dreaded winter. The cataract forming on the green wheated hill, ice on sundial and steps and calendar. It is snowing. After you were unborn, it was my turn to carry you in a world before me, trying to imagine you. I am your parent at the beginning of winter. You are my child. We are one body, one blood, one red line melting the snow, unbroken line in falling snow. And the other one's called Apples. Waking beside a pile of unsorted keys in an empty room, the sun is high. What a long, jagged string of broken bird song they must have made as they gathered there, by the ears deaf with sleep and the hands empty as waves. I remember the birds now, but where are the locks? When I touch the pile, my hand sounds like a wave on a shingle beach. I hear someone stirring in the ruins of a glass mountain after decades. Those keys are so cold they melt at my touch, all but the one to the door of a cold morning, the colors of apples.
Do you think a poet can speak for non-human life forms?
Only in a kind of general way. I mean, I don't think that I could speak for a bird, a particular bird. What we do is we make them part of our myth, the myths that we live by, and then we speak for them. We speak for the myths that we've made of them. I mean, think of the animals and other forms of life that begin to talk in our myths. That, in a way, is speaking for them, but it's speaking for them only as we project ourselves onto them, as we project our own view of the world onto them, and allow them to. We're really allowing them to speak for us.
Well, I mean, having a sense like that you're rejecting the idea of a poet as a medium.
No, I'm not rejecting it. I'm simply saying that there are two sides to it. That it's never absolute. It is relative. And yet, one of the reasons we can't define poetry is because we all feel that poetry really is, there is something absolute about poetry. That there is a, but the moment you're talking about an absolute, you're talking about something that cannot be described, because you're using, the only things that you can describe it with are relative.
Do you find in your own work that
we know what poetry is because we know somewhere the way we respond to it. I mean, Houseman has that famous thing about, if he didn't dare think of a real line of poetry when he was shaving because he cut himself, But however learned and sophisticated people are who really care about poetry, it's a visceral response. There's something in the skin or in the gut or something that or in the eyes, the tears or something that responds to it. It can be the most that is subject to all kinds of abuses and to sentimentality and schmaltz and all sorts of things. I mean, it can veer off into that. And how one makes the distinction between the false apparitions and the true ones is something that one can talk about at great length, and that I think criticism still is far from defining. I mean, it's very easy to say things are sentimental, and we know that there's an element of falsehood to it, but it's a very hard thing to describe. And we know that great and true art probably is not sentimental, but to make the distinction and to be able to clearly always distinguish between them is something that I think that it would be a very bold or arrogant person who claimed that he could do. There are two poems that have to do with my family, two more. The first of them is called Sun and Rain. Opening the book at a bright window above a wide pasture after 5 years, I find I am still standing on a stone ridge looking down with my mother at dusk into a river, hearing the current as hers in her lifetime. Now it comes to me that that was the day she told me of seeing my father alive for the last time. And he waved her back from the door as she was leaving, took her hand for a while and said nothing. At some signal, in a band of sunlight, all the black cows flow down the pasture together to turn uphill and stand as the dark rain touches them. The other is a poem about a sister of my father's, an aunt of mine, who was always referred to in the family as Birdie. That was not her, as they say, Christian name, but that was what they called her. And that's the title of the poem, Birdie. You don't think anything that I know of, but as for me, when I think of you, I don't know how many of you there are, and I suppose you thought there was just the one. How many times you may have been born, as my father's other sisters would say, in your body. Nobody is interested in things like that in the family. Somebody wrote down, though, that you was born one time on April 20, 1874, so that my grandmother at that occasion was 13. And the hardest thing to believe in that account, as I think of it, is that she was ever 13 years old, the way we grew up to hide things from each other. So she had a little baby at that age, and that was you, Birdie, that was one of you. Did you know? It presents a different picture of my grandmother from the one I was brought up to. That was the you she had when she was 13, which goes a long way to explain her Puritanism and your gypsy earrings, and all the withered children who came after, and their scorn of your bright colors and your loud heart. And maybe even your son, who was delicate and an artist, and painted heads of Jesus on church walls where they crumbled and could not be moved, and you were having a good time and dying in Arizona. Except that as everybody knew, that you was nothing but a mistake in the writing, and the real Birdie came along when Grandma was into her 20s and she had her firstborn, a little baby girl, which explains nothing. Puritanism, earrings, the children who came after, your son, the frail artist, the crumbling heads of Jesus, the having a good time and dying in Arizona. That was the you I met one morning in summer whom nobody could explain, for you was different. Inviting all them so unexpected and not heard of for so long, your own mother, younger brother, younger sisters, new nephew, to breakfast laughing and waving your hands with all the rings, and them not listening, saying they was in a hurry to drive farther and see the family, and you going on telling them everything there was to eat. I want to read a poem about a poet who was a teacher of mine when I was very young, and who I admire enormously as a poet, John Berryman. The poem is called Berryman. I will tell you what he told me in the years just after the war, as we then called the Second World War. Don't lose your arrogance yet, he said. You can do that when you're older. Lose it too soon and you may merely replace it with vanity. Just one time he suggested changing the usual order of the same words in a line of verse. Why point out a thing twice? He suggested I pray to the muse, get down on my knees and pray right there in the corner, and he said he meant it literally. It was in the days before the beard and the drink, but he was deep in tides of his own through which he sailed, chin sideways and head tilted like a tacking sloop. He was far older than the dates allowed for, much older than I was. He was in his 30s. He snapped down his nose with an accent I think he had affected in England. As for publishing, he advised me to paper my wall with rejection slips. His lips and the bones of his long fingers trembled with the vehemence of his views about poetry. He said the great presence that permitted everything and transmuted it in poetry was passion. Passion was genius, and he praised movement and invention. I had hardly begun to read. I asked, how can you ever be sure that what you write is really any good at all? And he said, you can't. You can't. You can never be sure. You die without knowing whether anything you wrote was any good. If you have to be sure, don't write. I don't think there is any absolute way of judging a poem. I think that it has to do always with response before it has to do with interpretation. That
You mean that Duchampian sense that, like, history decides what's great and what's not great? I mean,
well, not altogether, because history too is extremely relative. I mean, after all, the poets who are thought to be great in one age are ignored in another, and then they're rediscovered. And does this mean that they were great at one time and not great at another? Of course not. There is something that's been there, and is one age has been blind to, and another age has its eyes open to. And this is something that we can't ever tell about our contemporaries.
but in your own poetry, do you feel like that there's certain poems that that you have seen people respond to as your best poems? And do you think those are your best poems?
One of the things that I feel happy about that is that people respond to different poems. And, all of a sudden someone will get very excited about a poem that no one else has noticed. And it means a great deal to them, and it seems to speak to their lives. Now, this may be entirely for the wrong reasons. It may be because of something that Mommy did to them when they were 7 years old that Mommy never did to anybody else. I don't know, but Gide said somewhere in his journal that the one thing he had a nightmare about was that he would come to be known as the author of that book, as though, he'd never written anything else. And Yeats was haunted all his life by the Lake Isle of Innisfree and wished nobody had ever read it,
Did you become a poet consciously?
Oh, I think so, yeah. My father was a minister, and I was fascinated by hymns. That were the only poems I knew. So I tried to write hymns.
You ever published any of it?
No.
That would be...
I wanted my father to use them in church.
Really?
He never did.
But after that, I mean, was there did you study poetry? I mean, were you a student of somebody, or?
Yes, for about a year, I used to take my poems to John Berryman, and he would tell me all the things that were the matter with them. And that's that poem, John Berryman, that you mentioned.
Why did you choose Berryman?
Because he was there. I didn't know anything about him, when I first met him, and I read everything he'd written. And
Had you already considered yourself a poet?
oh yeah, very. I was very self-important.
From what age? So when
Oh, I think I was about 16 when I decided that this was really what I had to do.
And why? Why do you think it was?
Something which I think is probably very common to many people in the arts is sort of I remember the sort of anguish of it, the feeling that the world was there, and that both the world and my relation to it were passing, and that there was nothing I could do about it. And this, I think, is the link between poetry and that religious dimension. Late spring. Coming into the high room again after years, after oceans and shadows of hills and the sounds of lies, after losses and feet on stairs, after looking and mistakes and forgetting, turning there thinking to find no one except those I knew, finally I saw you sitting in white, already waiting. You of whom I had heard with my own ears since the beginning, for whom more than once I had opened the door, believing you were not far. History. Only I never came back. The gates stand open where I left the barnyard in the evening, as the owl was bringing the mouse home in the gold sky at the milking hour. And I turned to the amber hill and followed along the gray fallen wall by the small mossed oaks and the bushes of rusting arches bearing the ripe blackberries into the long shadow, and climbed the ancient road through the last songs of the blackbirds. Passing the last live farms, their stones running with dark liquid, and the ruined farms, their windows without frames, facing away, looking out across the pastures of dead shepherds whom nobody ever knew, grown high with the dry flowers of late summer, their empty doorways gazing toward the arms of the last oaks, and at night their broken chimneys watching the cold of the meteors. The beams had fallen together to rest in brown herds around the fireplaces, and in the shade of black trees the houses were full of their own fragrance at last, mushrooms and owls and the song of the cicadas. There was a note on a page made at the time, and the book was closed and taken on a journey into a country where no one knew the language. No one could read even the address inside the cover, and there the book was, of course, lost. It was a book full of words to remember. This is how we manage without them. This is how they manage without us. I was not going to be long. I think that if you are really writing out of the right place, your rational mind certainly is at work. To pretend that it isn't is silly. But your rational mind is not running everything. And that there's part of it which is coming out of places that you don't know at all, which are intuitive and which are not probably limited by your own personality. Different kind of poem called After School. For a long time I wanted to get out of that school where I had been sent for the best. I thought of climbing down the vine outside the window at night after the watchman had turned the corner to the boiler room in the sweet autumn dark. I wanted to slip through the still dining hall and down the cellar stairs in the girls' wing, where I had set the waltzing in the first book of War and Peace. I would pass unseen in that crowd into the cellar and the secret door to the steam pipes and under the street to the swimming pool. I would have persuaded a girl I liked to meet me there, and we would swim whispering because of the echoes, while the light from the street shone through the frosted windows like the light of the moon, all down the hot room where the sound of the water made the heart beat loud to think of it. But I never got away then, and when I think now of following that tunnel, there is a black wolf tied there waiting, a thin bitch who snaps at my right hand. But I untie her, and we find our way out of there as one, and down the street, hungry. Nobody in sight at that hour. Everything closed behind us. The sound of the light. I hear sheep running on the path of broken limestone, through brown curled leaves fallen early from walnut limbs at the end of a summer. How light the bony flutter of their passage. I can hear their coughing, their calling and wheezing, even the warm greased wool rubbing on the worn walls. I hear them, passing, passing in the hollow lane, and there is still time. The shuffle of black shoes of women climbing stone ledges to church keeps flowing up the dazzling hill around the grassy rustle of voices on the far side of a slatted shutter, and the small waves go on whispering on the shingle in the heat of an hour without wind. It is Sunday. None of the sentences begins or ends. There is time. Again, the unbroken rumble of trucks and the hiss of brakes roll upward out of the avenue. I forget what season they are exploding through, what year the drill on the sidewalk is smashing. It is the year in which you are sitting there as you are, in the morning speaking to me, and I hear you through the burning day, and I touch you to be sure, and there is time, there is still time. There is a deep relation between any poet and the language, the language itself, which is both the kind of the mother and the muse and all of these things. They're all there in the language. That I think that, you know, a poem is a kind of gift to the language. Giving something back for what the language is giving. This is one's real debt to one's own species. It's a debt to the language. I mean, I've never been able to feel the proper post-18th century democratic debt to any society. You know, we're told about this wonderful society that we have. It's wonderful in some ways, but you know, it's part hype too. The language keeps cleansing itself of hype. The hype keeps flooding into it, and there's a kind of self-cleansing thing in the language. There are a number of poems that have to do with Hawaii, where I've been living for years. This is one of them, but it doesn't have to be Hawaii. You can make it as near to home as you can bear it. It's a poem called Conqueror. When they start to wear your clothes, do their dreams become more like yours? Who do they look like? When they start to use your language, do they say what you say? Who are they in your words? When they start to use your money, do they need the same things you need, or do the things change? When they are converted to your gods, do you know who they are praying to? Do you know who is praying for you not to be there? This is a related poem. It's really a poem about history, and as you know, history is usually written, or was until recently, in a kind of linear way that I've often found unsatisfying, and I expect many historians find unsatisfying too. But it does create the illusion that things happen in one at a time, in sequence like that. And as you know, everything always happens at once. So, I mean, the title of the poem is Chord, and it's not, you know, string chord, but music chord. While Keats wrote, they were cutting down the sandalwood forests. While he listened to the nightingale, they heard their own axes echoing through the forests. While he sat in the walled garden on the hill outside the city, they thought of their gardens dying far away on the mountain. While the sound of the words clawed at him, they thought of their wives. While the tip of his pen traveled, the iron they had coveted was hateful to them. While he thought of the Grecian woods, they bled under red flowers. While he dreamed of wine, the trees were falling from the trees. While he felt his heart, they were hungry and their faith was sick. While the song broke over him, they were in a secret place and they were cutting it forever. While he coughed, they carried the trunks to the hole in the forest the size of a foreign ship. While he groaned on the voyage to Italy, they fell on the trails and were broken. When he lay with the odes behind him, the wood was sold for cannons. When he lay watching the window, they came home and lay down. And an age arrived when everything was explained in another language. Different kind of poem called Knock. There is a knock on the door and nobody is answering. A wave can be heard breaking. On a train from Florida, my mother offered me her bowl of peaches when I was 3 and did not want them. And I watched the white jacket of the man carrying them away on their tray along the corridor while a silent grief rose in me. A plane roars into silence. They have to keep going as though they were alive. They are hurtling toward the known world, which it is hopeless to reject and death to accept. I open the door. I think that what we as a species have been doing for a long time is so destructive that it may have passed points of no return already, and that we may not be able to survive in the world. I mean, our species, life probably will, but to me it's a really doubtful point whether we will or won't. You know, the most obvious thing is that we may blow ourselves up with a bomb, but you know, we're not very far from terrible air pollution and water pollution and all of these things. And there are lots of ways through overpopulation and spread of diseases and things that we can't control, that we may destroy ourselves. And I think that that we're destroying the environment at a rate that we may not be able to survive. So in that sense, I don't know whether I do have a strong sense of history. I don't have a very strong sense of the future. You know, in the Renaissance, poets said, "I may live, but my words will be remembered forever," and so forth. I don't have that feeling. I feel that I'm writing for everybody, you know, in all ages. But that's much too vague, you know. Because I'm not limiting it to any group of people. What I would like to write. I mean, I like to feel that anyone who can read poetry and wants to read poetry will be able to understand what I'm writing and will want to. But more than that, I can't say. Snow. Comes the dust falling in the air, comes in the afternoon the sunbeam, comes through the sound of friends, comes the shadow through the door, comes the unturned page, comes the name, comes the footstep, comes to each wall the portrait, comes the white hair. Comes with the flowers opening, comes as the hands touch and stay, comes with late fortune and late seed, comes with the whole of music, comes with the light on the mountains, comes at the hours of clouds, comes the white hair. Comes the sudden widening of the river, comes as the birds disappear in the air, comes while we talk together, comes as we listen to each other, comes as we are lying together, comes while we sleep, comes the white hair. I want to read two quite different poems. These have not been in the book. The first of them is in the voice of a man who I admire very much. His name was Rumphius. Actually, his name was Georg Edvard Rumpf, but he changed it to Rumphius. He was born in the late 16th century in Germany, and more or less shanghaied. I mean, he signed onto a ship, but they deceived him and the Dutch and took him to the Dutch East Indies, where he spent the rest of his life. And he became a great botanist and wrote the first 5-volume Flora of the Indies and an Encyclopedia of the Indies. This was 200 years before Linnaeus. He didn't have all of those Aristotelian Latinate names and classifications. He just described things as he saw them with wonder that stayed with him all his life. His writings, if you're interested in such things, a selection of them has been beautifully translated and introduced and published by the University of Massachusetts Press in a volume called The Poison Tree. The Blind Seer of Ambon. I always knew that I came from another language, and now even when I can no longer see, I continue to arrive at words. But the leaves and the shells were already here, and my fingers finding them echo the untold light and depth. I was betrayed into my true calling and denied in my advancement. I may have seemed somewhat strange, caring in my own time for living things with no value that we know. Languages wash over them one wave at a time. When the houses fell in the earthquake, I lost my wife and my daughter. It all roared and stood still, falling where they were in the daylight. I named for my wife a flower, as though I could name a flower. My wife dark and luminous and not there. I lost the drawings of the flowers in fire. I lost the studies of the flowers, my first 6 books in the sea. Then I saw that the flowers themselves were gone. They were indeed gone. I saw that my wife was gone. Then I saw that my daughter was gone. Afterward, my eyes themselves were gone. One day I was looking at infinite small creatures on the bright sand, and the next day is this hearing after music. So this is the way I see now. I take a shell in my hand, new to itself and to me. I feel the thinness, the warmth, and the cold. I listen to the water, which is the story welling up. I remember the colors and their lives. Everything takes me by surprise. It is all awake in the darkness. Now, this poem is in the form of a letter, but you're not told anything about who it's to or who it's from, except it's obviously it's to someone slightly younger than the person who's, not obvious, but you imagine that it is. It's called The Hill of Evening. You will remember, I think, through the crowd of events there, how quietly the days pass here on the hill, where the 2 houses most of the year seem to be the whole of the inhabited world. At your last visit, I was still living in part of the big house above the steep meadow with the old couple and their grown children, but we walked one afternoon down the overgrown cart lane through the woods, and I showed you the smaller empty house by the pasture where I live now when I am here, the windows facing out from the trees onto the open hill, dropping away to the stream. We were talking of ambitions and age and of change, and I have come to think of each age, I should tell you, as a season always complete in itself, as the days here seem sometimes to be all evening, the hour when, if you remember, we looked up from the lane in the first twilight and saw the fine single stroke of the new moon drifting across the valley, which is why I am writing to you. Today is Sunday, the day of visits, rare though they are on the hill, but this morning brought an old man on his way up the lane to the big house who wanted to look in here where he had known someone in his youth, and he sat till noon talking of a time before I was born, the encounters in the lane, the racing hearts, the hayloads, the dancing all night in the valley and walking back before daybreak. And then we went up the lane together to the old woman's birthday party. I do not recall having seen so many gathered there, even at funerals, and today such triumphant celebration as at a wedding, flowers everywhere, long tables covered with white cloths under the lime trees, and the meal went on for hours with the toasts, the speeches, and one by one the old standing up in the waving shadows of the leaves with a hush rising around them, and then from a distance their voices approaching with moments out of somewhere invisible to most of us, but still clear to some, and indeed what they still see around us, and at last the music of the roofer's accordion, and 2 violins with songs the old woman asked for, and a few of the middle-aged got up and began the old dances. Then the old were dancing, and even the young joined in, laughing, all circling to the one time, the tunes repeating over and over, nobody wanting them ever to stop, and the faces flushed, the eyes wide with surprise, asking, is it possible? Is it happening? And then it was over. They sat breathless or wandered off, and when I had said my farewells as formally as though I lived far away, I started back down the lane, for by then it was already evening, already twilight, and of course I was thinking again of age and of what in each season seems just out of reach, just beyond what is in front of us, a kind of ghost of what we see, to which we offer up our days. And when you were here, I could see that you hoped I would have something to say to you about all that. And it was then that we looked up to see the thin moon. Now this evening there was no moon, but in the long summer grass to the right of the lane as I came, I saw a shining crescent, a new sickle, bright as water, and the blade glittering with the dew, and I stood there as startled as the faces of the dancers, not knowing whose it could be, how it had come to be there, what I was to do with it now that I had seen it. Leave it where it was, to rust in the grass, and perhaps, as I thought for a moment, to disappear, to be really lost, although, as you know, no one steals anything here. And it must have been partly to see whether it was really there that I reached down and picked it up, cool as the dripping grass, to carry home and lay on the table here in front of me, and tomorrow I must try to find who it belongs to. Thank you.
What do you think in our time is the strength of poetry, or the thing that poetry has the most to give in our era?
I hope that what it does is to help to keep us alive, and I don't mean existent in a world of pollution. I mean really alive to the world around us, alive to our relation to each other, alive to our feelings. You know, I think one of the things that for example, is happening in the world of commodities is that our senses, our relation to our senses. Yeah, I think the tree and our five senses are the same thing, and that our relation, as our relations to any of them become more attenuated, our relations to all of them become more attenuated, and our relation to ourselves do. And all this gabble about self-awareness is we're talking about something because we're in grave danger of losing it. I mean, you don't find a Quiche Indian talking about the need for self-awareness. I mean, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. They're aware of themselves. They're aware of their dreams. They're aware of what things smell like, taste like, look like, sound like, you know. And they haven't reached the point where one series of perceptions has blotted out all the others. I think that one of the roles of poetry is to remind us of our sensual presence in the world, which is our presence in the world.